Jerusalem had survived sieges before. It had watched armies gather beneath its walls, heard stones crash against its towers, and seen men kill in the name of heaven. But in the autumn of 1187, the people inside the city understood that something was different. The great Crusader army that should have protected them was gone. Its knights were dead, captured, or scattered. Its most sacred battlefield relic had been taken. And outside the walls stood the man who had destroyed them, Saladin. For 88 years, Jerusalem had been ruled by the Crusaders. Now the city waited for revenge. Many remembered what had happened when the Crusaders first captured Jerusalem in 1099. The streets had filled with blood. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants had been killed in terrible numbers. Generations had carried the memory of that violence. Now the balance of power had reversed. Saladin had the city surrounded. He had the army. He had the momentum. And he had every reason to answer massacre with massacre. Yet what happened next would define his name for centuries. Because the story of Saladin is not simply the story of a warrior who captured Jerusalem. It is the story of a man born far from a throne, raised inside a divided Muslim world, forced to fight enemies from outside and rivals from within, defeated when he appeared unstoppable, and challenged by one of the most dangerous kings medieval Europe could send against him. By the end, Saladin would become a hero to millions, a respected enemy in the stories of his opponents, and a symbol larger than the empire he built. But before the legend, there was only Yusuf ibn Ayyub. He was born around 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, north of Baghdad, into a Kurdish family serving powerful rulers in a dangerous age. Later tradition claimed that on the very night of his birth, his family was forced to leave Tikrit. Whether every detail of that story is true or not, the image is fitting. Saladin entered the world as his family was moving into uncertainty. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, and his uncle, Shirkuh, were military men. They found service under the Zengid rulers, first under Imad al-Din Zengi and later under his son, Nur al-Din. These were not peaceful times. The Middle East was divided among competing dynasties, governors, princes, caliphs, and military commanders. Alliances changed quickly. A ruler who was a friend one year could become an enemy the next. And along the eastern Mediterranean coast stood the Crusader states. They had been created after warriors from Western Europe answered the call of the First Crusade. Between 1097 and 1099, Crusader armies captured cities across the Levant, including Antioch and Jerusalem. They established new Christian-ruled territories in lands where Muslims, Eastern Christians, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Turks, Kurds, and many others had lived for centuries. To the people of Western Europe, these states were sacred victories. To many Muslims in the region, they were foreign occupations made possible by political division. Yet for decades, no single Muslim ruler had the power to remove them. Saladin grew up in this fractured world. He spent important years in Baalbek and Damascus, cities filled with soldiers, scholars, merchants, officials, and religious teachers. He learned the skills expected of a young man from a military family, including horsemanship. He was also known to enjoy polo, a demanding game that trained riders to move at speed and control a horse under pressure. But nothing about his youth guaranteed that he would become the most famous Muslim ruler of the Crusades. Some accounts describe him as more interested in religion and learning than in military glory. He was not born a king. He did not inherit a great empire. He did not begin his career commanding armies of his own. His path to power began because of his uncle. Shirkuh was a hard, experienced commander serving Nur al-Din, the ruler of Syria and one of the strongest Muslim leaders of the age. Nur al-Din had inherited his father Zengi's struggle against the Crusader states, but he understood that defeating them required more than battlefield courage. It required unity. And to the southwest lay Egypt. Egypt was wealthy, strategically vital, and politically unstable. It was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shiite dynasty whose power had weakened. Court factions struggled for control, viziers rose and fell, and outside forces saw opportunity. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem saw Egypt as a prize. Nur al-Din saw Egypt as something even more important. If the Crusaders controlled it, Syria could be trapped between enemies. But if Nur al-Din's forces controlled Egypt, the Crusader states could be pressured from two directions. This made Egypt the center of a deadly contest. In the 1160s, Shirkuh led several expeditions into Egypt. Saladin went with him. The campaigns were confusing, brutal, and politically treacherous. Egyptian officials called for help, changed sides, made agreements with Crusader kings, and then broke them. Armies marched through deserts where water mattered as much as weapons. Cities negotiated while rival commanders prepared to betray one another. Saladin was still a subordinate. He watched how power truly worked. He learned that battles were only one part of war. Money, loyalty, marriage, religious authority, timing, and reputation could decide the fate of kingdoms before swords ever met. In 1169, Shirkuh finally gained control in Cairo and became vizier to the Fatimid Caliph. Then, only a short time later, Shirkuh died. The office passed to Saladin. The decision was astonishing. He was still young, probably around 31. He was a Sunni military officer serving as vizier inside a Shiite caliphate. Egyptian elites did not fully trust him. Nur al-Din expected obedience from him. Crusader armies remained close enough to threaten Cairo, and many of the soldiers around him were loyal not to Saladin, but to their own commanders and interests. His new position looked powerful. In reality, it could have become a death sentence. Saladin moved carefully. He placed members of his family and trusted supporters in key positions. He reorganized the military. He defeated challenges inside Egypt and strengthened defenses against outside attack. He began replacing the political foundations of Fatimid rule with institutions loyal to Sunni authority. He could not move too quickly. A sudden attack on the old order might unite every enemy against him. So he waited. Then, in 1171, the name of the Fatimid Caliph was removed from the Friday prayer, and the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad was recognized instead. The Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, came to an end. Saladin had not yet declared himself an independent sultan. Officially, he still served Nur al-Din. But Egypt was now under his control. And control of Egypt meant wealth, soldiers, grain, fleets, and a base from which a new dynasty could rise. The relationship between Saladin and Nur al-Din became increasingly tense. Nur al-Din had sent Shirkuh and Saladin into Egypt. He expected the country to remain part of his political system. But Saladin was building power of his own. He delayed certain meetings. He gave reasons for not joining campaigns. He protected his position while avoiding a direct break with the man who had once been his master. A confrontation seemed inevitable. Then history intervened. Nur al-Din died in 1174. His heir was a child. The political structure he had built began to fracture almost immediately. Governors, military commanders, and relatives competed for influence. Cities looked for protection. Old rivalries returned. Saladin faced a choice. He could remain in Egypt and watch Syria divide, or he could march north and claim the role Nur al-Din had once played. He chose to march. Saladin entered Damascus in 1174 and presented himself not as a thief stealing a child's inheritance, but as a protector restoring order. It was a powerful argument, but not everyone accepted it. For years, he fought other Muslim rulers as often as he fought the Crusaders. This is one of the realities often hidden by the legend. Saladin spoke of unity and holy war, but unity did not appear because he asked for it. It had to be negotiated, purchased, arranged through marriage, or imposed by force. He defeated rival forces near Hama. He pressured cities that resisted him. He faced opposition from Aleppo and Mosul. He married Ismet al-Din Khatun, the widow of Nur al-Din, strengthening his connection to the previous ruling house. He also survived attempts on his life. Twice, assassins came dangerously close to killing him. One attack reportedly reached his tent. Blades struck near his head, and only armor, loyal guards, and chance kept the rising ruler alive. For a man trying to unite a region, the message was clear. He was never safe. Saladin responded by moving against the strongholds of the Nizari Ismailis, known in many Western sources as the Assassins. He besieged Masyaf in Syria, though the campaign ended without a final conquest. The precise reasons remain debated, but afterward the immediate threat from that direction eased. Still, Saladin's greatest danger was not always an assassin in the night. Sometimes it was his own confidence. In 1177, Saladin invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a large force. He believed the Crusader defenses were weak. The young King Baldwin IV, suffering from leprosy, seemed unable to stop him. Saladin's army spread out to raid and gather supplies. Then Baldwin struck. Near Montgisard, the Crusaders launched a sudden attack. Saladin's forces were caught unprepared. His army broke apart. Many men were killed. Saladin narrowly escaped and withdrew toward Egypt. It was a humiliating defeat. The future conqueror of Jerusalem had been beaten by a sick young king leading a much smaller force. And that defeat mattered. It taught Saladin that numbers meant little without discipline. It taught him that the Frankish heavy cavalry could still destroy an army that lost formation. It taught him never to assume that a weakened enemy was a harmless one. He did not collapse. He adapted. Over the next years, Saladin rebuilt his strength. In 1179, he defeated Crusader forces at Marjayan. He captured and destroyed the newly built fortress at Jacob's Ford, a position that threatened the approaches to Damascus. At the same time, he continued the slower war for Muslim unity. Aleppo finally came under his control in 1183. Mosul resisted longer, but through military pressure and negotiation, Saladin secured recognition of his authority by 1186. His realm now stretched across Egypt, much of Syria, parts of northern Mesopotamia, the Hejaz, and Yemen through members of his family and allied commanders. It was not a modern centralized state. Local rulers, relatives, governors, and military elites still held enormous power. Saladin had to reward them, persuade them, and constantly hold the coalition together. But for the first time in generations, the Crusader states faced a ruler who could draw resources from both Egypt and Syria. And inside the Kingdom of Jerusalem, unity was disappearing. King Baldwin IV was dying from leprosy. His courage had been real, but his body was failing. The question of succession divided the kingdom. When Baldwin died in 1185, the crown passed briefly to the child Baldwin V. The boy died the following year. Then the struggle exploded. Sibylla, sister of Baldwin IV and mother of Baldwin V, claimed the throne. She crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan, as king. But powerful nobles distrusted Guy. Raymond III of Tripoli became his rival. The kingdom that needed unity most was split by personal hatred and political fear. And on its frontier stood Reynald of Châtillon. Reynald was bold, aggressive, and dangerous. He controlled the strongholds of Carrick and Montreal, positions overlooking routes between Syria, Egypt, and Arabia. He had attacked caravans even during periods of truce. Earlier, he had also supported a naval raid into the Red Sea, threatening Muslim shipping and alarming the wider Islamic world. Saladin came to despise him. According to Muslim accounts, Saladin vowed that if Reynald ever fell into his hands, he would kill him personally. Then Reynald attacked another caravan during a truce. Saladin demanded the return of the captives and property. Reynald refused. The fragile peace was finished. In 1187, Saladin gathered forces from across his territories. Troops came from Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, and the Jazira. His coalition was larger than anything he had previously brought against the Crusader kingdom. But he still needed the enemy to make a mistake. So he created a crisis they could not ignore. Saladin attacked Tiberias. The city was connected to Raymond of Tripoli, one of King Guy's greatest political rivals. Raymond's wife, Esquiva, was inside the citadel. The Crusader leaders gathered at the well-watered camp of Sephoria to decide what to do. Raymond gave shocking advice. Do not march. Even though his own wife was trapped, he argued that the army should remain near water. Tiberias might fall, but the kingdom's field army would survive. Saladin could not remain forever. If the Crusaders marched across the dry land in summer, they would be moving exactly where Saladin wanted them. At first, King Guy accepted this advice. Then the pressure began. Gerard de Ridefort, master of the Knights Templar, urged the king to act. Reynald of Châtillon also pushed for an advance. To remain still, they argued, would look weak. It would abandon Christian territory. It would damage the king's honor. During the night, Guy changed his decision. At dawn on July 3, 1187, the Crusader army left the springs of Sephoria and began marching toward Tiberias. The moment they left the water, the trap started to close. Saladin's mounted archers surrounded the marching columns. They attacked, withdrew, and attacked again. Their purpose was not to break the Crusader army immediately. It was to slow it. Every delay meant more heat. Every wounded horse reduced mobility. Every hour carried the army farther from safety and deeper into thirst. The Crusaders struggled across the dry landscape in heavy equipment. Dust filled their mouths. Arrows struck men and animals. Units became separated. The infantry could not always protect the cavalry. The cavalry could not force a decisive battle against enemies who refused to stand still. By evening, the Crusaders had failed to reach the water of the Sea of Galilee. They camped near the volcanic hills known as the Horns of Hattin. There was little water. Saladin's men controlled the routes around them. During the night, Muslim forces tightened the encirclement. Fires were lit in the dry grass and brush. Smoke drifted toward the exhausted Crusaders. The heat, flames, and smoke increased their suffering. Saladin's army had water brought forward. The trapped army could see what it could not reach. By the morning of July 4th, the Crusader host was no longer the disciplined force that had terrified armies for generations. It was a thirsty mass fighting for survival. The battle became desperate. Crusader knights launched charges towards Saladin's position. At moments, they came dangerously close. Saladin was not watching a simple collapse. Heavy cavalry, even exhausted, could still kill. His own son reportedly showed excitement at what looked like victory, but Saladin warned him not to celebrate while the enemy king's tent still stood. The Crusader infantry tried to reach the slopes, but formations broke. Some men abandoned the knights. Others were cut down or captured. Reynald of Tripoli led a charge that passed through an opening in the Muslim lines, but the gap closed behind him. He escaped with only part of his force. The rest were trapped. The royal tent fell. The relic known as the True Cross, carried by the Crusaders as a sacred symbol of protection, was captured. King Guy of Lusignan was taken alive. So was Reynald of Châtillon. The two prisoners were brought before Saladin. Guy was exhausted and terrified. Saladin offered him a cold drink. The king drank and passed the cup to Reynald. In the customs of the time, offering drink could symbolize protection. Saladin made it clear that he had not personally offered safety to Reynald. He accused Reynald of breaking truces and attacking pilgrims and caravans. Then Saladin killed him. The exact details differ between accounts, but the outcome is certain. The vow had been fulfilled. King Guy expected that he might be next. Saladin told him that kings did not normally kill kings. Guy lived. Others did not. Many captured Templars and Hospitallers were executed. These military orders were considered especially dangerous and unlikely to accept permanent peace. Other prisoners were ransomed, enslaved, or distributed among the victors. This was not the gentle warfare of later legend. Hattin was a medieval catastrophe. Men died from arrows, blades, heat, fire, and thirst. Prisoners faced execution or slavery. Families across the kingdom would never see fathers, sons, or brothers again. But strategically, the result was even greater than the human destruction. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had lost almost its entire field army in a single battle. Its king was a prisoner. Its leading knights were dead or captured. Many castles and cities still had walls, but few had enough trained men to defend them. Saladin moved quickly. Acre surrendered. Tiberias fell. Nazareth, Caesarea, Jaffa, Nablus, and other towns came under his control. Strongholds that might have resisted for months now faced an army with overwhelming momentum. Yet one decision would later cost him dearly. Tyre did not fall. Crusader survivors gathered there under Conrad of Montferrat, an energetic and capable nobleman who had recently arrived in the region. Saladin attempted to take the city, but its defenses and coastal position made it difficult. He eventually moved on. Tyre remained a doorway through which the Crusader presence could survive. For the moment, however, Saladin had a greater prize in view: Jerusalem. The city was crowded with refugees. Survivors from fallen towns had fled behind its walls. There were many civilians, but very few experienced knights. Balian of Ibelin became the central figure in its defense. Balian had escaped Hattin. He originally asked Saladin for permission to enter Jerusalem only to rescue his wife and children, promising not to take up arms. Saladin granted the request, but once Balian entered, the people begged him to stay. They had no commander with enough authority to organize the defense. Balian informed Saladin that he could not keep his promise. Rather than punish Balian's family, Saladin allowed them safe passage with an escort. Then the siege began. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin's forces surrounded Jerusalem. Catapults hurled stones against the walls. Archers filled the air with arrows. Defenders made sorties and tried to destroy siege equipment. The attackers searched for weak points while the people inside prepared for the possibility that the city would be stormed. At first, Saladin's chosen position gave the defenders advantages. He shifted his army toward the northeast, near the Mount of Olives, where the terrain allowed his engineers to work more effectively. Miners attacked the foundations of the wall. A breach began to open. The defenders knew what would happen if the army poured through. Balian went out to negotiate. He offered surrender. Saladin initially remembered that the city's representatives had earlier rejected generous terms. He also remembered 1099. But Balian warned that if the people believed death was certain, they might destroy their own wealth, kill prisoners, damage Islamic holy sites, and launch one final suicidal attack. Whether every word later recorded was spoken exactly as written, the threat captured the danger facing both sides. A storming of Jerusalem could become uncontrollable. Saladin agreed to terms. The population would be allowed to ransom itself. The sums were set according to age and sex. Wealthy residents could pay. Money from the city's treasury helped free thousands of poor people. Saladin, his brother Al-Adil, Balian, and others also released many who could not pay. Not everyone was saved. Some inhabitants who lacked ransom were enslaved. The surrender was far more restrained than the massacre of 1099, but it was not a modern humanitarian evacuation. It remained a medieval conquest, with fear, separation, loss, and human beings treated as the property of victors. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The date was symbolically powerful. In the Islamic calendar, it was associated with the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, in which Jerusalem held a sacred place. Muslim worship was restored at the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Christian symbols added during Crusader rule were removed from Islamic sanctuaries. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed. Eastern Christian communities were allowed to remain, and Christian pilgrims would later continue to visit the city under agreed conditions. Jewish life also returned more visibly under Muslim rule as families and communities re-established themselves in Jerusalem. The city had changed hands, but the revenge massacre many feared did not happen. That decision became the foundation of Saladin's later reputation for mercy. It also created a powerful contrast. When Crusader forces captured Jerusalem in 1099, mass killing followed. When Saladin captured it in 1187, surrender, ransom, and controlled departure replaced general slaughter. Medieval Muslim writers praised him as the champion who restored the holy city. Later Christian writers, even while remembering him as an enemy, increasingly described him as honorable, generous, and princely. The legend of Saladin had begun, but his greatest victory created his greatest danger. News of Jerusalem's fall crossed the Mediterranean and struck Europe like a shockwave. The loss was not seen as an ordinary military defeat. Jerusalem was the spiritual heart of the crusading movement. Its capture demanded an answer. A new crusade was called. This time, some of Europe's most powerful rulers took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, led a massive army overland. Philip II of France prepared to sail east, and Richard I of England, later known as Richard the Lionheart, joined the expedition. Saladin had defeated the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now he would face the military resources of Western Europe. At first, disaster struck the crusade before all its forces could unite. In 1190, Frederick Barbarossa drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia. His death shattered the morale and organization of his army. Many returned home. Others continued in smaller numbers. But the threat did not disappear. The Crusaders still held Tyre. And in 1189, Guy of Lusignan, released from captivity, gathered forces and began besieging Acre, a major port held by Saladin. The situation became extraordinary. The Crusaders surrounded Acre from the land. Saladin's army surrounded the Crusaders. Ships brought reinforcements, food, weapons, disease, and death. The siege continued for nearly 2 years. Men died in assaults, counterattacks, storms, hunger, and epidemics. Camps became graveyards. Fortifications rose around fortifications. Neither side could easily destroy the other. Then the kings arrived. Philip of France reached the siege in 1191. Richard of England arrived soon after. Richard was everything Saladin had been warned about. He was aggressive, physically brave, experienced in war, and willing to take enormous risks. He could inspire soldiers through personal courage. He also had a violent temper and little patience for delay. He was not a simple opposite of Saladin. The two men shared important qualities. Both understood theater and reputation. Both knew that a ruler had to be seen as courageous. Both could negotiate while preparing to attack. Both could show generosity. And both could order terrible violence when they believed strategy demanded it. Acre surrendered in July 1191. It was a serious defeat for Saladin. The Crusaders captured the city, its harbor, and much of the remaining Muslim fleet there. Negotiations began over prisoners, money, and the return of the true cross. The process broke down. Richard believed Saladin was delaying. Then Richard ordered the killing of thousands of Muslim prisoners outside Acre. The victims included soldiers and others held after the surrender. Saladin's forces could see the executions but could not stop them. Muslim armies attacked in fury and were driven back. Saladin later ordered the killing of some Christian prisoners in retaliation. The chivalric legend did not prevent atrocity. The Third Crusade had entered a darker phase. After Acre, Richard marched south along the coast. His goal was to secure ports and create a base for an advance toward Jerusalem. Saladin followed. The English king kept his army close to the sea, where ships could supply it. Infantry protected the more valuable knights and horses. Crossbowmen answered mounted archers. Richard enforced discipline because he understood the lesson of Hattin. Do not break formation. Do not chase an enemy who wants to pull you apart. Do not abandon water and supply. Saladin harassed the march relentlessly. Arrows fell. Horses were wounded. Soldiers collapsed in the heat. Muslim cavalry attacked and withdrew, trying to provoke the Crusaders into a reckless charge. Richard refused. Until Arsuf. On September 7, 1191, Saladin launched a major attack near the coastal plain of Arsuf. His forces pressed the Crusader column. The pressure became unbearable. The Hospitallers at the rear repeatedly asked permission to charge. Richard ordered them to wait. Then, whether by command or because men could endure no more, the Crusader cavalry surged forward. The charge struck hard. Richard committed the rest of his knights, and Saladin's forces were driven back. Arsuf was a Crusader victory. It did not destroy Saladin's army, but it proved that Hattin had not made him invincible. Richard had learned how to survive Saladin's style of war. Saladin had learned that Richard was not another Guy of Lusignan. The road toward Jerusalem remained open. Yet taking Jerusalem was not the same as holding it. This became the central problem of the crusade. Richard's army advanced inland during the winter. At points, the Crusaders came close enough to imagine the holy city within reach. Men wept at the thought of seeing Jerusalem again. But the weather was terrible. Rain turned roads into mud. Supplies became difficult. Horses weakened. Saladin damaged wells, removed food, strengthened the city, and prepared to surround any besieging force. Richard's commanders feared that even if they captured Jerusalem, they might be trapped far from the coast and destroyed. The Crusader army turned back. The decision caused anger and heartbreak. Months later, they advanced again. And again, they stopped. Jerusalem remained in Saladin's hands. Between campaigns, negotiation continued. Messages passed between Richard and Saladin through envoys, especially Saladin's brother Aladil, whom the Crusaders called Saladin. At one point, an extraordinary marriage proposal was discussed. Richard's sister Joan might marry Aladil, and the couple might rule Jerusalem under an arrangement meant to satisfy both sides. The plan never became reality. Religious objections, politics, and mistrust made it almost impossible. But the fact that it was considered reveals how complicated the conflict had become. These men were not only trying to win battles. They were searching for an ending neither side would consider total humiliation. By 1192, Richard faced urgent problems at home. His brother John was maneuvering in England. The French king had returned west and threatened Richard's lands. The Lionheart could not remain in the eastern Mediterranean forever. Saladin was also exhausted. Years of campaigning had strained his treasury, his horses, and his coalition. Emirs wanted to return to their own territories. The unity he had created required his constant presence. Both leaders needed peace. But before peace came one final shock. Saladin attacked Jaffa in the summer of 1192 and nearly captured it completely. Richard arrived by sea with a small force and launched a sudden counterattack. He fought with extraordinary personal courage, helping drive Saladin's troops away from the city. The encounter strengthened Richard's legend. It also showed the limits of Saladin's control over the battlefield. His coalition could overwhelm weakened positions, but it could not always withstand a disciplined counterattack led by a commander willing to stand in the front line. Neither man had destroyed the other, so they negotiated. In September 1192, a truce was agreed. The Crusaders retained a narrow coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. Christian pilgrims were permitted access to the Holy City. Ascalon's fortifications were to be demolished, preventing it from becoming an immediate threat to Egypt. The Third Crusade was over. Richard had won battles, recovered important coastal territory, and restored a reduced Crusader state. But he had not recovered Jerusalem. Saladin had lost Acre, suffered defeat at Arsuf, and failed to remove the Crusaders from the coast. But he still held the city that mattered most. The two great rivals never met face to face. Their relationship was carried through messengers, gifts, negotiations, rumors, and battlefield observation. Later stories expanded their connection, sometimes inventing scenes of friendship that never happened. The truth is more powerful than the myth. They respected the danger each represented. They tested one another for years. And in the end, both understood that survival mattered more than a final, impossible victory. Richard left the Holy Land in October 1192. Saladin returned to Damascus. He had spent much of his adult life moving between camps, courts, sieges, and negotiations. His body had endured heat, disease, long rides, sleepless nights, political crises, and constant war. Only a few months after the crusade ended, he fell ill with fever. Saladin died in Damascus on March 4, 1193. He was around 55 or 56 years old. According to his biographer, the ruler who had controlled Egypt, Syria, and vast territories beyond left remarkably little personal wealth. His generosity had been so extreme that officials sometimes hid emergency funds from him, fearing he would give everything away. This image contributed to the legend. The conqueror died without a treasure equal to his fame. His empire did not remain united for long. Saladin had distributed territories among sons, brothers, nephews, and loyal relatives. After his death, they competed. The Ayyubid dynasty continued to rule in Egypt and Syria for decades, but the personal coalition he had built began to fragment. That reveals one of the limits of his achievement. Saladin united much of the Muslim Near East around his leadership, but he did not create a system strong enough to remain fully united without him. Yet his historical impact was undeniable. He ended Fatimid rule in Egypt and established the Ayyubid dynasty. He united Egypt and Syria under one strategic command. He destroyed the main Crusader army at Hattin. He recovered Jerusalem. And he survived the Third Crusade without surrendering it. But the real Saladin was more complicated than the perfect knight of later stories. He fought fellow Muslims for power. He used religion as sincere belief, political mission, and a tool of legitimacy. He ordered executions. He accepted slavery and ransom as normal parts of medieval warfare. He made mistakes, including the failure to capture Tyre when the Crusader kingdom was at its weakest. He suffered serious defeats at Montgisard and Arsuf. He could be patient, generous, and merciful. He could also be ruthless. That complexity does not make his story smaller. It makes it human. Saladin's greatest weapon was not his sword. It was his ability to recover. After Montgisard, he rebuilt. After assassination attempts, he continued. After years of resistance from Muslim rivals, he negotiated and fought until his coalition held. After Arsuf, he refused to risk everything in one desperate battle. He understood something. Many conquerors never learn. A ruler does not need to win every fight. He needs to survive defeat, preserve his purpose, and recognize the moment when patience becomes more powerful than attack. That is why Hattin mattered so much. The battle was not a miracle that appeared from nowhere. It was the result of 20 years of political preparation, military learning, failed campaigns, repaired alliances, and disciplined waiting. Saladin did not capture Jerusalem because he was destined to do so. He captured it because he united resources his enemies believed would remain divided, then forced them into the kind of battle they had been warned not to fight. And when the city finally stood before him, his most remembered act was not destruction. It was restraint. History often turns people into symbols. In Europe, Saladin became the noble enemy, a Muslim ruler imagined through the ideals of Christian chivalry. In the Muslim world, he became the liberator of Jerusalem and the model of unity against invasion. In Kurdish memory, he became one of the most famous Kurdish figures ever to shape world history. Every age rebuilt him according to its own needs. But behind all those images stands a man born without a crown, who entered Egypt as his uncle's young subordinate and died as the ruler whose name had crossed continents. He did not eliminate the Crusader states. He did not create permanent unity. He did not win every battle. Yet when the greatest counterattack Western Europe could organize finally reached the Holy Land, Jerusalem remained beyond its grasp. Richard the Lionheart sailed away. The banners over the coastal cities changed. The armies dispersed. But above Jerusalem, Saladin's victory still stood. History remembers the conqueror. It remembers the mercy. It remembers the rivalry. But perhaps Saladin's greatest achievement was something more difficult than winning a city. He convinced a divided world that unity was possible. And for one decisive moment, that belief changed the course of history. Was Saladin's rise the result of faith, political genius, and patience? Or did his enemies destroy themselves before he delivered the final blow? For more cinematic stories of empires, betrayals, battles, and the people who changed history, subscribe and continue the journey into the past.